A mother's love for her children can never be accurately measured, and this was proven in the case of Barbara Mabee Abel, who sacrificed her freedom just to keep her 6-year-old son, Dale, alive. Barbara was a single mother who had just returned from work on November 14, 1974, and met with the greatest shock of her life. A man had broken into her home in West Palm Beach, Florida, raped her twin sister Beverly Abel, and was about to kidnap her son. This man was the most dangerous serial killer of his generation, responsible for the deaths of dozens of men, women, and children around Georgia, Florida, and beyond. Though Barbara had no idea who he was, she made use of some quick reasoning to salvage the situation. She single-handedly kept both Beverly and Dale alive by offering herself in exchange for their safety. This is the twisted case of Barbara Mabee Abel, a true superhero mom and sister who defied the odds just to keep her loved ones alive. Born on April 17, 1943, to Albert Earl Mabee and Matilda P. Mabee, Barbara and her twin Beverly came into the lives of their parents and other family members as little bundles of joy. She grew up in a loving household in the company of her siblings, including her twin sister Beverly Mabee, Albert Earl Mabee and Matilda P. Mabee, brother Gary Mabee, and another sister, Jacqueline Helen. However, Barbara's twin sister Beverly was born with cerebral palsy and had to face many challenges while growing up. Barbara stood beside Beverly like a pillar of support, being with her every step of the way and helping her overcome several difficult situations. After graduating from high school and college with flying colors, Barbara grew up to be a professional copywriter. They all lived in her mother's house in West Palm Beach, Florida, a few miles away from where Barbara worked at a radio station. A few months earlier, in May 1974, Barbara's mom passed away. As a result of this, Beverly stayed home and depended fully on the 31-year-old Barbara, whose son also attended school. After the death of their mom, nothing out of the ordinary happened until on November 14, 1974, when Barbara returned home from work and met a horrible scene. When we got to the house, I looked out for Beverly and told Dale, "Go look for her, honey," while I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. That's when I heard a voice say, "Don't turn around or I'll shoot." It was the voice of Paul John Knowles, the Casanova Killer, who terrorized the entire state of Georgia and Florida in 1974. Like an idiot, I turned around. The man, who I later learned was Paul John Knowles, was there with a sawed-off shotgun by his side. Then Dale ran in and said, "Beverly's in the bedroom, she's bleeding." Knowles took me into the bedroom, where Beverly was bound and gagged. She had blood dripping from her mouth, and she was naked. I lost it. I said, "Did you rape my sister?" The Casanova Killer was planning on taking her son, Dale, with him after robbing the family of its mortgage money and would probably kill them all. But Barbara had other plans instead. She wasn't going to give up her son at any cost. She told Paul to take her away and leave her son alone. I knew I had to use reverse psychology. I didn't want anyone to get hurt. He kept telling me about killing someone, and he tied up my son and my sister in bed. The neighbor kept knocking on the door. I thought he was going to get his gun and shoot the neighbor, shoot us all. I thought I had to be the best actress in the world. That's when I said I would ride with him wherever he wanted to go, as long as no one was hurt. I needed him to think that I was in love with him. I didn't want him to take my son or hurt anyone, so I gave it my best performance to help us all live. Barbara's method proved effective, as the Casanova Killer fell for her tricks. She was a pretty woman, and the thought of having her all to himself really appealed to him. But before she left with Paul, Barbara kissed her sister Beverly goodbye and promised her that everything would be all right. Both got into Barbara's car and left, while Beverly and Dale stayed behind. So I walked out of the house with him and into the car while he held the shotgun. We took off into the sunset. I didn't know who he was, but I knew he could kill me. I decided I would do whatever I needed to do to survive. I told him how I thought he looked like Robert Redford. I was trying to build up his confidence. I prayed to the Lord to give me words that would make him fall in love with me. I knew I had to charm him or die. While on the road, Paul began to talk about a lot of things with Barbara, who pretended to pay attention to him so that her life could be spared. She acted accordingly to get Paul's affection, and this became her strongest weapon throughout the journey. By intelligently lavishing Knowles with compliments, Barbara hoped to build his confidence and get him to lower his guard. Fortunately, it worked out just as planned. As he was driving on the road, he started talking about his family. Then he started talking about killing people because he had done it already. He became comfortable with me. I knew he liked me, so I had to take advantage of that. I needed to stay alive. Barbara noticed how he listened attentively to the radio while driving. He told her they were moving to Georgia, and she noticed he was fiddling with the radio in hopes of hearing his kidnapping had made the news. In the car, he was getting frustrated when there would be no news on the radio. He was trying to do the radio and drive stick shift. He kept telling me we were going to Georgia. I believe if he had taken me there, he would have killed me. In what appears to have been pure luck, Paul Knowles suddenly changed his mind about taking Barbara to Georgia and instead drove to a local motel in Fort Pierce, Florida, where the young woman continued her theatrics. Eventually, we stopped at a motel in Fort Pierce, Florida, because he was just so tired. As we walked up to the front desk, I put my arm around him. He had the shotgun under his coat, and I knew for a fact that he would shoot the lady at the desk if there was any trouble, so I acted like we were married. At that moment, he was very charming. But he was like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Paul Knowles booked a room at the motel where he intended to spend the night with Barbara. He tied Barbara to the bedpost and sexually assaulted her in the process. When we got into the room, he told me to take all my clothes off. That evening, he raped me. I had to figure out how to get out of there. The sheets were tied around my ankles. My wrists were also tied by the bedsheets. He put a gag in my mouth. I was terrified. I was praying to the dear Lord that I would get out of this. I said, let me get home to Beverly and Dale. Exhausted from the ordeal, Barbara fell asleep soon after she was tied up and raped by Knowles. Then something happened. She saw her beloved late mother, Matilda, appear to her in a dream. I was lying on my back, and all of a sudden I saw my mother. She was wearing this beautiful white gown. She came to me and she was like an angel. She was like, you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. God's with you. When she awoke from the dream, Barbara finally discovered who had taken her captive. Paul Knowles had turned the TV on and saw their faces flash on the screen. The news reported that Barbara was missing and that her son Dale, who was tied up by Paul, had freed himself. The young lad also rushed next door to tell their neighbor what had happened, and the neighbor called 911. Police were looking for Knowles, and the smile on his face showed how happy he was to be a wanted man. At the motel, he kept the TV on the whole time. The news came on, and all of a sudden, my face and his face were on all the stations: NBC, CBS, and ABC. The news was about me being kidnapped and how he had killed somebody. He was excited. That's when it finally hit me. He wanted to be famous. He wanted to write a book, and being a radio copywriter by profession, I told him I could help. My job was what saved me because this serial killer wanted me to tell his story. Barbara was held captive for 18 hours. She made it through the night with little sleep, praying that Knowles wouldn't kill her. Once the sun rose on November 15, 1974, a hungry Knowles took Barbara to a nearby restaurant to eat. The next day, we went to a restaurant and I pretended to be in love with him because I knew that if I opened my mouth, people would be killed. Barbara's stomach rumbled as she smelled the fresh bread. As Knowles chowed down on a hearty meal of eggs, toast, and hash browns with orange juice, she looked around hoping someone would recognize her. But Knowles' gun, which was by his side, reminded her not to make any sudden movements. After taking dinner, they both returned to the motel where she was raped again. When we got back to the motel, he raped me again, tied me up, and gagged me before he left to make a phone call. Hours later, the news reported on Knowles again, but this time he wasn't impressed with the way the media portrayed him. He took his gun and pointed at Barbara's head, shouting "bang bang" while he laughed hysterically. After tying her up, Paul Knowles went outside to make a phone call. Barbara frantically looked around and then turned her attention to the nightstand and saw the key to the motel room. Paul Knowles had locked himself out. Barbara's thoughts ran wild, but she couldn't do anything as her hands, mouth, and legs were tied up. She thought of running out of the motel, but there was no way she could help herself, so she stayed bound until her captor came back. After a while, Knowles returned to the room but couldn't get in and immediately realized that he had locked the door with the key inside. When he got back at around 1 a.m, he realized he left the key in the room. He was locked out and couldn't get back in. Through the door, he told me he knew I couldn't talk. I was gagged, but that he was leaving. The last thing he said to me was, "I love you." Then he took off. But Barbara was too busy thinking of how to free herself from the shackles and never cared about what Paul told her anyway. I was trying to figure out how the heck I was going to get this key while still being tied up. That's when the dear Lord helped me. I saw some glass and I tried to get it to break so I could cut the bed sheets off my wrist. That didn't work. Eventually, I figured out the nightstand had a glass tabletop with a corner that was already broken. That's how I got free, believe it or not. Just then, her prayers were miraculously answered. She knew it was the only opportunity she had to escape and did all that was in her power to break free. She managed to untie the gag in her mouth, hands, and legs before calling for help. I don't know how I did it, but the gag came out of my mouth and I got loose. I called the motel manager and said I was kidnapped by a serial killer. After law enforcement arrived, I got on the phone with Dale, who said, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy, I love you. When are you coming home?" I told him I'd be home soon and that I loved him to pieces. Meanwhile, after he left Barbara, Paul Knowles continued driving towards Georgia in her car and was eventually apprehended by police on November 16, 1974. Florida Highway Patrol Trooper Charles Campbell pulled Knowles over during a routine traffic stop. The young cop immediately recognized the stolen vehicle, but unfortunately, Paul Knowles was faster than Charles as he grabbed the latter's gun and took him hostage. Switching to the patrol car, Knowles pulled over a businessman by the name of James Mayer and took both of them hostage in Mayer's vehicle. He eventually drove both men to Pulaski County, Georgia, where he handcuffed them to a tree and shot them in the head. Meanwhile, a statewide manhunt and perimeter were issued against Knowles, who had been chased by the Henry County Sheriff's deputy, Charles Hancock, after earlier spotting him with two hostages at the back of the patrol car he was driving. Unfortunately for Knowles, he crashed the vehicle into a nearby tree and ran out on foot while firing shots at the pursuing officers. He was shot in the foot by Chief Detective Philip Howard during his escape, which somehow slowed down his pace as he ran into the woods in a bid to evade them. However, it would be a 27-year-old hospital worker and Vietnam War veteran, David Clark, who was out hunting that day with his shotgun, who held Paul Knowles captive until the cops arrived. The Henry County investigators Paul Robbins and Billy Payne soon arrived on the scene, arresting and handcuffing Knowles, who was outside of the perimeter established for the manhunt and would have escaped. Meanwhile, back at the Fort Pierce Motel, the police had arrived and were listening to Barbara explain everything about her kidnapping to them. That afternoon, she was subsequently escorted to her home in West Palm Beach and reunited with her family. But it wasn't the end for Barbara, as she lived in fear of the unknown due to the fact that her captor was still out there, walking around freely. However, when she heard the news that Paul Knowles had been captured by the police on November 17th, she and her entire family were relieved. Paul Knowles was eventually kept in Henry County Prison, Georgia, for the next few weeks, where he admitted to killing over 35 people. But the authorities could only verify 18 victims scattered across different locations in Georgia and Florida. During this time, authorities discovered Paul Knowles had recorded audio-taped confessions that he had mailed to an attorney. These tapes were never released to the public but were reviewed by a grand jury in 1975. The tapes, along with all transcripts, were destroyed after being ruined beyond repair in a flood of the federal courthouse in Macon, according to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. On December 18, 1974, Douglas County Sheriff Earl Lee and Agent Ronnie Angel from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation were traveling down Interstate 20 with Paul Knowles, who was handcuffed in the back seat. Their destination was Henry County, Georgia, where Knowles, per a Georgia Bureau of Investigation press release, admitted to dumping a handgun he had taken from Florida State Trooper Charles Eugene Campbell after killing him with it. But while going on the way, Paul Knowles made one of the worst mistakes after his kidnapping of Barbara Abel when he tried to outsmart the detectives. He used a paperclip to open one of his handcuffs before lunging for Douglas County Sheriff Earl Lee's gun, but this time around, he wasn't so lucky. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation reported that Knowles grabbed Lee's handgun, discharging it through the holster in the process, and while Lee was struggling with Knowles and attempting to keep control of the vehicle, Angel fired 3 shots into Knowles' chest, killing him instantly. The Casanova Killer had met his death at the age of 28. News spread like wildfire throughout the country, much to the excitement of Barbara Abel's family. "I think that was one of the happiest days of my life," said Barbara Abel. "It was wonderful because he wouldn't kill anybody else. We praised the Lord." However, Barbara Abel said that following Knowles' death, she suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, but it was her faith in God that helped her family rebuild. "I chose to forgive John Paul Knowles for what he did to me. I did not want to be another statistic. I chose to be a survivor. Years later, she fell in love with her husband, Jim, whom she has been married to for the past 43 years. He's 6'6" and good looking. I was just so blessed to meet Jim because he's my soulmate now. She also went ahead to reveal that she survived breast cancer and remained strong due to her faith in God. It would take years before Beverly and Dale spoke candidly about the crime, though in 2019, Beverly died. Dale grew up to be a fine young man. He remembered everything, even though he was only 6 years old. Now he's a prayer warrior for others. He's always been helping people. He has his own business and his own beautiful family. Beverly died of cancer in 2019. She was the strongest woman I'd ever met in my life. She put up with cerebral palsy and made it a joke. She was amazing. I had decided to write a book, One Survivor, before she died, and she was so happy that I was writing it. I did it for the two of us. Barbara Mabee Abel is today a published author with a best-selling book titled One Survivor, 35 Dead: How I Became the Sole Kidnapped and Raped Survivor of the Casanova Serial Killer, Paul John Knowles, in which she gave a detailed account of the horrifying incident. Following the release of her book, which was published on August 31, 2021, she posted on social media about it. She wrote, "After decades of wanting to put this story on paper, lots of hard work, friend encouragement, and a promise to my twin sister, it has finally come to fruition, with God's help making me wait to include more survivor tales." When interviewed several decades later, she said, "I had no idea how many he murdered. He tried to keep telling me, and I wasn't listening." Today, she hopes her story will give other survivors of a crime hope that they can make it to the other side. "Nobody knows what life is going to bring," she said. "I want to help people. I want to help people come out of the darkness, just like I did." She revealed that due to the fact that she was a copywriter, Paul Knowles told her that he wished to write a book about all the murders he had committed. According to Paul's brother and lawyer, he was aware of the fact that he would be caught, so he was allegedly trying to publish a book so that the proceeds could go to his mother. But apart from Barbara, there was another survivor of Paul Knowles' crimes named Sandy Fox, a 45-year-old British journalist living in Atlanta who was also a writer by profession. Paul had met Fox on November 8, 1974, and took her home, where they lived together for 3 days. Fox said that he impressed her with his looks, which were a cross between Robert Redford and Ryan O'Neal. The pair spent the next few days together, but Fox said Knowles was unable to perform when they attempted to have sex. They parted ways on November 10th, and on the next day, Knowles picked up an acquaintance of Fox and demanded sex from her at gunpoint. Fortunately, the lady escaped and notified the police. When patrolmen tried to apprehend him, Knowles brandished a sawed-off shotgun and escaped. However, the fact that the two women survived his deceptive charm has led to a theory floating around that he deliberately let the two women live so that they would write about him and make him famous. Well, somehow he became famous, as many movies, documentaries, and stories have been made about him, the Casanova Killer. Born in Orlando, Florida on April 25, 1946, to Thomas Jefferson Knowles and Bonnie Knowles Nee Strickland, Paul Knowles lived in foster homes before first being incarcerated at the age of 19. In early 1974, Knowles was serving time at Ryford Prison in Florida, now known as Florida State Prison, when he began corresponding with a divorcee named Angela Kovich in San Francisco, eventually becoming engaged. Angela paid for his legal counsel, and upon his release, Paul Knowles flew directly to California to be with her, but she called off the wedding. Her reason being that Knowles projected an aura of fear, which terrified her, and although Paul claimed to have murdered 3 people on the streets of San Francisco that night, it was never verified. He returned to Jacksonville, Florida on July 22, 1974, and was soon arrested after stabbing a bartender during a fight. However, he escaped after picking the prison lock. This turned out to be the beginning of his notorious killings, as a few hours later he broke into the home of 65-year-old Alice Curtis and robbed her. Desperate for money and transportation, Knowles tied up and gagged the old woman before escaping with her car. Alice Curtis ended up being choked to death on the gag, and Knowles stuck around long enough for police to recognize the stolen car. His face was soon splashed across the local television stations. Over the course of 4 months, he went on a killing spree that didn't consist of any patterns. Sometimes he murdered people out of necessity because he was looking for money or another car. Other times he appeared to take someone's life on a whim, like he did to Jane Doe, a hitchhiker he picked up while heading north. His victims also included 35-year-old Karen Wine and her 16-year-old daughter Dawn Marie Wine, who were both bound, raped, and strangled on October 16, 1974, after their Marlborough, Connecticut home was broken into. Subsequent investigations led the police to find that the only thing missing from their home was a tape recorder, which was in the possession of Paul Knowles. Less than a month later, he met Barbara Abel, who turned out to be his nemesis. That's where we call it a wrap on today's video. We hope you enjoyed the video and didn't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more true life stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in our next video.